Okay, this video is how do you learn the ancient Greeks? So I love the ancient Greeks, and I think they're a great pleasure to study. Percy Shelley, the romantic poet from England in the 1800s, he said the most interesting time ever in the history of the world was the ancient Greeks in the time of Pericles in Athens, which is around 400 BC. It's fantastic. It's by far the most interesting culture of the ancient culture. It's like 10 times better than any other ancient culture. It's one of the things that everybody should learn about the ancient Greeks. Western civilization is based on the ancient Greeks, more than the Old Testament. Everybody talks about the Old Testament. The Old Testament is boring compared to the ancient Greeks. Don't get me wrong, there's lots of important, useful things to know from the Old Testament, okay? Especially Genesis. But I'm just telling you, the ancient Greeks are this giant scaffold of knowledge and wisdom and fun and interesting stories and metaphors, and they're a tremendous part of the English language, especially for science and biology and whatnot, astronomy and on and on. Okay, so where do you start? I decided to make this because I just reread this one book, Mythos, by this guy Stephen Fry. Listening to the audiobook in the car, and it's a good book, but it's not the place to start. The place to start is Edith Hamilton. And she's the best one because she gets it. She loves the ancient Greeks. And she wrote this book about them. She wrote a book about Greek mythology. And the Greek people loved her so much, they made her an honorary citizen of Athens. And you want to read books by people who love the subject. Because somebody who loves the subject, they're going to show you what they love about it and show you the beautiful stuff to make you more likely to love it or at least like it. Okay, most of the books written by professional professors are kind of lightweight, mediocre, and subdued. Okay, they're sort of writing for their colleagues rather than writing for you. Anyways, this is the book to start with, The Greek Way. And she makes the point that most other cultures of those days, and in the modern world too, there's some brutal dictator that kicks everybody's butt and says, do it my way or the highway. And look at Egypt, their art didn't change for over 1,000 years because anybody who tries to do something different gets their butt kicked, okay? So what was nice about the ancient Greeks, they were a bunch of different islands and mountainous ranges separating places, so that and they had a lot of trade with other societies, so there was a lot of variety of opinion. And the best place in ancient Greek by far was Athens. Athens had the most respect for intellectual heroes. It's not a coincidence that most of the great Greek geniuses came out of Athens, because the intellect was celebrated in Athens. It was an aristocratic society. Yes, there were slaves, but there were slaves everywhere in the ancient world. And there's a lot more slaves nowadays than is widely talked about. The only thing that's preventing slavery is Christianity, okay? And people don't want to say that, but it's the truth. Okay, so anyways, getting back to the ancient Greeks. She loved them, and she talks about how they brought all these innovations. Most of the good stuff in the modern world, it comes from the ancient Greeks and it comes from Christianity, okay? From the ancient Greeks, where do you think philosophy and theater, all this stuff, it came from the ancient Greeks, okay? And then the next book to read, you want to read this one. And again, you can watch the DVD course is the best one. And there's a lot of these DVDs are on YouTube. Is Rufus Fears. He's the best professor out of all the professors in the greatcourses.com. It's this company, thegreatcourses.com. They sometimes call themselves the teaching company. They also have a website nowadays called Wondrium, but he's their best professor of any subject. He's really knowledgeable, enthusiastic. He's Harvard PhD. He ended up at University of Oklahoma and in Indiana for a while. And his courses are so popular, it didn't matter how big the room. It would always be filled to the brim. Okay, so this is the guy, Rufus Fears. He's great, very enthusiastic, very knowledgeable, nice. He's a great old guy. And anyways, you can watch some of his videos for free on YouTube. You just type his name in Rufus Fears, you'll find a lot of them. And he's a great way. He talks about great Greeks, and he talks about these real heroic men of ancient Greek, and it's good stuff. Okay, so once you've decided you like that, it's good to know their mythology. Sort of their religion. And the best place to start would be go to this YouTube channel called The Life Guide. I've read and studied tons of stuff about Greek mythology, and this is the best one because they illustrate it very well with paintings. And they go through, this is like the 3.5 hour video of Greek mythology. And you watch that, and you'll see the pictures. It'll come alive for you. And then when you read the paperback books with no illustrations, it'll be easier to visualize in your mind and all the plays of the great, playwrights, Aeschylus, Euripides, Sophocles, Aristophanes, and all this. But anyways, that's really good. And they got some other shorter videos on Greek mythology, but they do a fantastic job of explaining things well and illustrating it. So they're magnificent. Okay, then probably the next book to read would be, again, Edith Hamilton, her book about mythology. It gets right to the point and explains things real clear. And you'll then, if you want, you can read the individual plays or you can listen to courses about them. They're quite extraordinary. The whole story of Oedipus, for example. Okay. It's also good to know Aristotle's theory on literature, drama, tragedy, and public speaking, things like that. Aristotle's the best of the philosophers. He's better than Socrates and Plato. Plato was interesting, though, because he wrote in the form of a play, because he wanted to be a playwright, he wanted to be a politician. He failed at both those things. And then as a philosopher, he wrote about politics in the form of a play, and Socrates was the hero. Okay, but actually a decent place to start, Masters of Greek Thought by Robert Bartlett. It's a good course. It's not great, but it's good. I'm not saying you got to start with this one, but it's one of the decent courses, okay, to get started with these guys. There's a lot of guys. You're going to be hearing about Plato and Aristotle and Socrates all the time if you start studying, history, philosophy, and culture. Alfred North Whitehead had said all of philosophy is just a footnote to Plato. Okay, Plato really broke it open, and he was an extraordinary philosopher. He's a bit of a pain in the butt, though, and Plato wanted things that a lot of people would have a problem with. He was a big believer in eugenics, and he was pissed off that Athens had lost to Sparta, and he wanted Athens to become more like Sparta, more of a collectivist society, and he approved of a lot of things that are not very pleasant. The idea of controlling the public with the noble lie, as he called it. He's very much more collectivist. Aristotle's sort of the opposite. He's individualist. And as Ayn Rand had said, he's the greatest philosopher of all time, the atlas of philosophy that holds the world of the intellect on his shoulders. And you love Aristotle the more you learn about him. He is the good. And Christianity comes out of these two places. Platonic Christianity fed into St. Augustine and all that predestination nonsense, and that fed into Martin Luther and the Protestants, and that's there's some good things about it, but there's a lot of problems with it. Aristotle fed into Thomas Aquinas and the Italian Renaissance, which was rather magnificent, etc. Okay. This was my favorite of the philosophy introductory survey books, The Great Ideas of Philosophy by Daniel Robinson, because he's another guy. He loves the ancient Greeks. He loves philosophy, and he tells you the truth about Aristotle and Plato. So it's a really good place to go. Daniel Robinson. He's better than Bartlett. Bartlett's good, but he's better. Daniel Robinson. Okay. The best book ever written about philosophy and how it relates to the modern world is The Cave in the Light by Arthur Herman. And the whole way down the path, this right here is Plato, this right here is Aristotle. He's pointing up to the sky, Plato, the perfect forms. This is Aristotle pointing down to the earth, saying practical, objective knowledge is more valuable to us than your theoretical Platonic forms. Ayn Rand described Plato as a mystic, and she much preferred sort of the empiric, objective philosophy of Aristotle. Ayn Rand really paid her dues. We're going to come back to her in a moment. Okay, here she is, Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand has a great essay. It's in her book, Return to the Primitive, and it's also, she has a good online YouTube lecture about comparing Apollo and Dionysus. So Apollo is the Greek god of logic, intelligence, intellect, the higher man, versus Dionysus is more like drunken, debauched. And she basically says Apollo reminded her of the Apollo landing in 1969 through NASA and all that, versus Dionysus reminded her of people using drugs at Woodstock concert. And she has a very clever essay about it. She's got a 1-hour lecture on it. It's very good. You're going to find that once you study the ancient Greeks, you're going to very often see things go in this debate between Apollo and Dionysus or between Plato and Aristotle, and it's a very good way of framing issues. The great thing about the ancient Greeks is everybody can enjoy them and like them. Nobody has a dog in the fight, okay? If you start talking about modern stuff from the last 100 years, lots of people are real offended if you don't see it the same way they do. Okay, and you start talking about religion, people are offended if you're not the exact same religion as them. But the ancient Greeks, again, nobody's an ancient Greek anymore, so you can talk freely and openly about all the nuance of it, and it's very enjoyable. And anybody can enjoy the ancient Greeks. Okay, that's another good thing. It's good to study the Peloponnesian War because the Peloponnesian War was very brutal, and there's a lot of lessons to be learned from it. Okay, the Greeks had done great to kick the butt of the Persians and keep them out of Greece, and they're very proud of themselves for doing that. But less than 100 years later, they drifted into a civil war between Athens and Sparta called the Peloponnesian War. And Thucydides had been disgraced. He was an admiral in the Athenian army, or navy, so to speak, and he had been disgraced. And he tried to redeem himself by writing a history of the Peloponnesian War. Very objective. It's well known as a historical masterpiece. And I had to read this my freshman year at Stanford, and it was a very good experience for me. We had to take an entire one-year course called The History of Western Civilization, and it was the best college class I ever took at Stanford. And we had to read all this stuff, the Peloponnesian War, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Aeneid by Virgil, etc. And the Peloponnesian War, there's a lot of brutal lessons to be learned. For example, Nietzsche, who was a scholar of the ancient Greeks, he felt it was like the most valuable book you could read. And I would recommend everybody read about the history of what happened to the Melians. The Athenians, as great as they were, they did some bad, brutal things, and they were very cruel and brutal to the Melians. They basically said unconditional surrender or we'll, destroy you right now. And the Melians didn't want to totally give in to them, and they brutalized them. And the only reason I tell you that, such an awful story, is because you should understand that's how people behave a lot of times, and you have to understand real human nature in order to be able to manage yourself in a world full of humans, okay? And it comes out in the ancient Greek history. So Pericles was great and noble in many ways. He was a great statesman, leader of Athens during the time of the beginning of the Peloponnesian War. But Pericles was also a jerk. He's a big part of what pushed Athens into fighting with Sparta. And what you'll see a lot of times is when a country gets divided and has a civil war, it becomes weak, and then another country comes in and conquers them, like the Macedonians with Alexander the Great. They just crushed Greece, and Rome crushed them, and Rome took over everything. So countries that aren't unified, they're weak. Look at Ireland's getting their butt kicked by England. They're a smaller country, and they were weak with all their chieftains in separate groups. Look at, ancient Italy, not ancient Italy, Italy of the Renaissance. Machiavelli would write about that, how sad he was that because Italy was all divided into their different cities rather than having them unified. Charles V came in and sacked Rome, kicked the crap out of them. Florence had all kinds of problems. French and Spanish invaders came and caused a lot of trouble for ancient Italy, and Machiavelli had wished they'd be unified, then they could protect themselves. But it's hard to get people to unify. I think Christians in general tend to be relatively independent-minded and jealous of each other, and they don't help each other very much, which is also why they're progressively always decreasing in the world since the ancient days, sadly. But there's a lot of historical lessons to be learned. And there's another thing I really liked about the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. It's another one of these stories where a guy really redeems himself, creating a masterpiece. Kind of reminds me a little bit like with Ben-Hur. Okay, Lew Wallace had been disgraced as a officer general in the Civil War in the USA, and he redeemed himself by writing Ben-Hur, okay, which was the greatest bestseller of the United States for a long, long time until Gone with the Wind came along, okay. And that was another off-the-charts masterpiece. Okay, so here's Thucydides, and this is like what I love about Thucydides. My work is not a piece of writing designed to meet the taste of an immediate public for popularity. It is meant to be a great masterpiece to last all time, to tell the truth about how men behave. Okay, and it is. It's a masterpiece. There's a lot of other really good lessons to be learned from this, and like what happened with the plague in Athens. It's valuable stuff. And again, if you don't got time to read all these books, most people don't, watch videos about them, and you'll start to learn about them. And keep a little note file on the ancient Greeks. You'll be surprised. If you read Western literature and Western culture, you study it in Western history, you are going to see the Greeks are like the fountain of all this other stuff. And it's beautiful and it's magnificent. And you're going to like the ancient Greeks. Like Schopenhauer said, The ancient Greeks knew how to live better than anyone else. Everybody except for Plato. Plato was a pain in the ass. Okay, Goethe had said the same things. Of all the previous cultures, the ancient Greeks were the best. Their mythology is just fantastic. So again, watch that 3.5-hour video first, and then you can start diving into these individual courses. This lady, Van Diver, she also teaches at thegreatcourses.com. At first, I thought she was a little bit of a pain in the butt, but then I started to like her, and she really does know a lot. She has a course on classical mythology that's good. She has a course on the Greek tragedies. I really enjoyed all the Greek tragedians. They're much more sophisticated. Just learning the Greek mythologies is a little bit simple, a little bit like Aesop's fables, but much more. The Greek gods are in your face. They're very sexual. They're very violent. They're very often unforgiving, but they're also quite interesting. It's like you want to talk about psychology. There it is. Okay, so all of this stuff is good, but the tragedians, Euripides, Sophocles, Aeschylus in particular, they go into way more detail, and so that becomes quite interesting. And she does a good job with it. And she does a good job also with the Iliad and the Odyssey. So here's her versions of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And then this guy, David Schenkner, he goes through all the ancient Greek playwrights, and he does a good job of doing that. He's a good professor. So him and Van Diver, they're good professors. They're not great. Rufus Fears is great. Arthur Herman is great. Edith Hamilton is great. But they are good. They're worth learning from. This is a guy by the name of Alex Petkus. He was a PhD at Princeton, majoring in the classics. He tends to emphasize Rome more, and he loves all the Roman macho men like Julius Caesar and stuff. But he's still good, and he talks a bit about the Greeks. So I like him. If you want to go see free videos, he's good. Gregory Aldrich is also good. He's another Roman historian. But we're not going to talk about Romans today. That's a whole other subject. Yes, of course, they adopted much from the Greeks, but the Romans are a whole other subject, and they're nowhere near as interesting as the Greeks. Okay, and then there's also what you would call the homosexual side of ancient Greece. It's a much smaller and minimal thing compared to what people think it is. But some of these guys, famous homosexuals, Nietzsche was a homosexual. That's part of why he hated Christianity, okay? But you have to ask yourself, who was Nietzsche? Nietzsche was kind of insane, okay? He died of syphilis, probably from prostitutes. And what I like about Nietzsche, he recommended individualism. Think for yourself. Read and study and think for yourself. That was all good. He had been a classics major himself, especially studying the ancient Greeks. He hated Socrates, okay? Socrates was put forth by Plato to defend him after he'd been sort of slandered in a sense, and he had been executed for disrespecting the gods, so to speak. But, Plato felt like, why was the best man in all of Greece destroyed? Okay, it was a terrible thing. And so he wanted to vindicate Socrates in all his stories about him. But he was also working towards this concept of Athens being an intellectual center versus the rest of Greek were kind of primitive and brutal, and they were proud of their fighting ability. Their greatest hero was Hercules, a physical, primitive, honest, tough guy, okay? Versus the new hero was Socrates. He was a new hero, the Athenian hero. Like Theseus had been a little more intellectual of the ancient Greek myths, but then there was Socrates, who was to show the young man a new type of hero rather than just the violent and brutal Achilles or the crafty, sneaky, but not very contemplative or articulate Odysseus, okay? So that's where sort of Plato was coming from. Nietzsche, though, declared himself to be a Dionysian. His heroes, the men he admired the most, would be like Napoleon, a brutal sort of dictator, conqueror type of guy, as well as Bismarck, okay? Nietzsche is really overrated, okay? That which does not kill us makes us stronger. No, it doesn't make you stronger if you injure your ankle or your knee or something. It makes you weaker, okay? And he was, anti-Christian, and, mankind without Christianity and God, they never can achieve fully. Okay, and then Oscar Wilde was another scholar of the ancient Greeks. Oscar Wilde, though, is much better than Nietzsche. If you look for quotes, there's tons of great quotes from Oscar Wilde. He was an Irish guy who went and made a tremendous success in Protestant England, which was not easy to do. He's one of the most quotable writers who ever lived. The Importance of Being Earnest is one of the greatest plays ever written. And Oscar Wilde, he did a lot of good stuff. Yes, he screwed up. Yes, he became a pathetic scumbag in the end, okay? He became a drunken alcoholic and abandoned his family, so I was sad of him for that. But before that, he had done a lot of good things, and his fairy tales were good, so I kind of have a soft spot in my heart for Oscar Wilde, okay? And don't get me wrong, Nietzsche is entertaining. I read a lot of his stuff and I liked it, but he's quite overrated. Ooh, I meant to show you one more thing. Okay, then I want to just briefly mention this guy. This is the guy, Stephen Fry. He's I think he's from England, and he is a very intelligent guy. He wrote Mythos, and he's actually written 2 subsequent books about ancient Greece. Another one called Heroes and another one called Troy. And in Mythos, he just basically goes over Greek mythology. And so what's good about the book? He's a very sophisticated writer. I think he's basically an Oscar Wilde wannabe. He wrote an entire book about poetry, The Ode Less Travel, and it's actually a very clever book. I liked his book, okay? And he is smart, he is funny, and he knows a lot, but there's something sort of a little sad and sinister about him. He very much exaggerates the homosexual component of Mythos and this gender fluidity stuff, and sort of he's coming from an angle, kind of like one of these 80-20 guys in the nutrition world. Is sort of what he really wants to push is all this homosexuality and gender stuff, okay? So he overdoes that in his book. But on the other hand, he is clever. He is funny. He does know the myths pretty well, and he makes the voices of the different characters, and it's entertaining, okay? But just to give you another take on the books that he writes, he really writes a book celebrating atheism, okay? And to me, that's kind of a joke. What I'm trying to say is, what does atheism say? It says that life is meaningless, that humans are just talking monkeys, and that there's no point to anything, okay? And that slavery is justified, and all the dummies should be made into slaves. That's basically where atheism is coming from. That's why dictators always want atheism, because then they're God and they can enslave everybody. So what I'm trying to say is he comes from it with a little bit of that mentality. So he tends to fall flat when he wants to go big, because he just doesn't have the metaphysical foundation to go big and be funny and insightful and profound. So he tends to just emphasize these little, vulgar scenes and jokes and stuff. So don't get me wrong. He is entertaining. He knows a lot. I enjoyed his books. But he's not a place to start. He's just a place, to sort of entertain yourself for a little while learning about the Greeks. So I did find him worth reading, but I definitely wouldn't put him high on the list, and I wouldn't let anybody start with him, especially not kids. So anyways, that's just some overview of getting started with the Greeks, and there's tons and tons. You're going to hear about them all the time, and if there's something I think it's important to know about if you want to be well educated. I think you kind of have to know the ancient Greeks, and that's been said by lots of scholars, historians, and philosophers. If you don't know the ancient Greeks, then you're an ignoramus.